Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Normally on Talking Points we discuss current events and current issues, but sometimes we take a break from that so that we can devote some time to discussing important historical periods. Today is one of those days. We're going to talk about French history in and around the 19th century. Wikipedia refers to this period as the long 19th century. My guest today and our guide on this historical journey is Dr. David Shafer. Dr. Shafer is the chair of the history department, and he is also a scholar of French history. Welcome, David, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Thank you, Dave.
Well, let's get started with this period, which runs approximately 125 years, beginning with the French Revolution in the late 1780s, and it extends all the way to the beginning of World War I in 1914. Most of us are familiar with the French Revolution and that iconic event of the storming of the Bastille in July of 1789. And a lot of people have compared this event, the French Revolution, to the American Revolution because they happen around the same time period, although the American Revolution started about a dozen years earlier. So what were the differences between the American Revolution, which is a rejection of the monarchy of Britain, and the French Revolution, which was an internal rebellion and a rejection of the monarchy of Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette?
Well, I would perhaps characterize them a little bit differently. I would characterize what happened in America as a war of independence and what happened in France as a revolution. And I think that pretty much sums it up. As a war of independence, and my colleagues in American history are prone to disagree with me on this for sure, but in my estimation, it was a war of decolonization. It was not so much a social revolution as a political revolution. I don't think that from a socioeconomic standpoint, the group that was in power before the American War of Independence was out of power afterwards. That is not true of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution really created the modern definition of the word revolution. Now, prior to the French Revolution, the word revolution was used in a political context, but it was used to refer to a return to a starting point. Now, it was first used, as far as I know, in 1688 in England, and it was meant to be the English reconquering liberties that they had lost over time, liberties that had existed at one point in history and gradually been eroded. They recovered them in 1688. In France, revolution came to mean a definitive break between past and present, that the present would no longer resemble the past. And that meant transformation in culture and politics and society and economics.
You mentioned liberties in England in that previous revolution. The battle cry of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity. Was that battle cry really indicative of the movement at the time? And if not, what were some of the enduring values of the French Revolution that continued to spawn rebellions and conflict for the next 100 years or so?
Liberty, equality, and fraternity came to define the French Revolution. They were the mantra of the revolution, and all three of them expressed the aspirations, something that was very different from the Ancien Régime, or Old Order in English. And this epitomizes what I was saying about the present not resembling the past in any way. What liberty, equality, and fraternity meant to different actors in the revolution, there was no unanimity on those terms. Did they endure into the future? Yes. They motivated in many respects. They were the defining ideals of the revolution or the aspirations of the revolution that in many cases were seen as unfulfilled, unmet. And so they did spur revolutionaries in the 19th century to strive for those goals, those objectives.
Now, if we jump forward a little bit, then Napoleon Bonaparte enters the scene, and in 1804 he declares himself emperor. Now, Napoleon had supported the revolution and even the reign of terror that followed. So how could Napoleon, on one hand, reject monarchy and on the other hand, declare himself emperor? How does that work?
Well, if you want me to speak as Napoleon, what I would say is he felt that this was the best means for fulfilling the promise of the revolution, for achieving the French Revolution, that he had to have a period of dictatorship, a period of empire, before France could transition into a republic, before Europe could transition into republics. That's what he would have said. So consequently, he wasn't planning, as he wrote, while in exile, an enduring empire as one that rivaled the enduring monarchies that preceded him, but that he was simply doing this as a means for solidifying the ideals of the revolution. This all along had been his intention.
Now, tell us about this man, Napoleon Bonaparte, about him as a person, as a man. What motivated him to want to be the emperor of continental Europe and the Mediterranean and so forth? He obviously must have had an outsized ego, but beyond that, why did he and those that supported him believe that what they were offering was different and better than what the governance was at the time in Europe?
Let me look at both parts of that question. The first is the Napoleon the individual, Napoleon Bonaparte the individual. The other is how he saw what he was peddling to the rest of Europe as an improvement. So taking the first part, Napoleon came from a minor noble family, Corsica. They were descended from Florentine nobility. Being from Corsica, he was seen as, when he was sent to schools, the military academies in France itself, he was seen by other nobles as very minor, as being almost like a wild beast being from Corsica. That was the stereotype at the time. And Napoleon apparently harbored those feelings. This is what stayed within him as a child. And if we can do a psychohistory for a moment, a psychological history, a psychological profile of him, one would say that so much.
He had a chip on his shoulder?
That he had a chip on his shoulder and that he was determined to right previous wrongs, personal wrongs. I don't know if that's exactly true. What Napoleon said, and as I answered previously all along, was that his intention was to solidify the principles of the revolution. The only way he could do so was by a period of very harsh rule, straddling a line, as he saw it, between royalism and Jacobinism associated with the terror. Now, he supported the terror at one point, but Napoleon's ideals were not necessarily in conformity with those. Taking the second part, though, of what you said about what he represented as being an improvement, well, he did represent an improvement over what existed in Europe. What existed in Europe was absolutism. It represented backwardness. It represented tradition over reason and rationality, logic. And say what you will about Napoleon, but he did represent that spirit of the revolution, of the ideals of reason. Napoleon also, one thing you didn't ask, but I'm going to bring it up, was that what Napoleon also had done was he reached an accord with the church. Now, the French Revolution had a very stormy relationship with the church, a very troubled one. But Napoleon reached the concordat with the church, in which he allowed recognized the Catholic Church as the Church of France, but also allowed for religious toleration of Jews and Protestants as well in France. Now, Napoleon himself was not religious, and he made the statement, in fact, that if religion didn't exist, we would have to invent it, because how else do we convince the person who's suffering in this dimension, the person who's poor in this dimension, that there's something better ahead and that they should be stoic and they should be observant and obedient in this dimension, because greater riches will await them in the afterlife.
Sounds a little bit like the opiate of the masses or something like that?
It's very much the opiate of the masses, and perhaps Marx based that on that.
Well, if we talk about Napoleon's accomplishments, other than establishing this empire and this series of alliances throughout Europe, he also established what was known as the Napoleonic Code and the Commercial Code and a set of laws. Tell us just briefly what that was.
A lot of it was to rationalize the economy. And we sometimes lose sight of that because that's not particularly interesting. When you read the majority of the Napoleonic Code, it really is boring, and it's very, very particular to that period. But what's more interesting is what it did in terms of gender. And what it did in terms of gender, and this is probably Napoleon amongst at his worst probably, was codifying the status of women. And what made that especially pernicious is that it didn't represent a departure from the imbalance between men and women, which had existed, pretty much since the beginnings of European society. But it put it into a legal code. And it didn't just put it into a legal code, but it rationalized it. It wasn't based on traditions of, that one could dismiss and dash away as, irrational, but based it on a sense of logic, or at least it tried to. And that's what made it very difficult. And those laws, the entire code, in fact, was the legal code in most European countries into the 20th century.
After Napoleon was exiled for the final time in 1815, there were still a couple of constitutional monarchies that ruled France. And one of them was return of the House of Bourbon, and the other was the House of Orleans. And between the two of them, they ruled for another, I think it was 34 years between the two. What is exactly a constitutional monarchy, and how was this different from the past?
Constitutional monarchy is a monarchy that is limited by a constitution, by a body of laws. It doesn't give full discretion to the monarch. That's the principal difference. During the Ancien regime, there was no body of laws, there was no constitution in France. The monarch was generally unrestrained other than by what he saw as the limits to how far he could really push things. In a constitutional monarchy, there are limitations. Now, you mentioned the Bourbons, who came right after Napoleon, and they were in power from 1815 to 1830. The first Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, the brother of Louis XVI, ruled in accordance with the charter that was established. And that was established because there was a sensation, a realization that much had been changed by the revolution and that there was no resetting of the clock. When he died in 1824, the youngest brother, Charles X, took over, and Charles X was committed to a resetting of the clock, and he felt he could do it. He could bring back laws on sacrilege and blasphemy. He could rule by fiat. These were the boundaries he tried to push, and of course 6 years into his reign, there was a revolution, and that was the end of the Bourbons.
And as we talk about this period of time, Victor, as we say it in English, Victor Hugo, but I know the H is silent in French, so it's Victor Hugo, wrote Les Miserables, one of the great novels of the 19th century. Many of us have seen the stage production, and it's fantastic, but did Hugo characterize the tone and tenor of the times accurately?
Yeah, more or less he did. More or less he did, to the extent that he does capture the sense of despair in Paris in the 1830s. He's referring to a revolution that occurred in 1832, a failed revolution, but one that was brought on by a cholera epidemic. Cholera started in 1827 in the Indian subcontinent, spread to what was then Persia in 1829, ultimately hit Europe early 1830s and hits Paris in spring of 1832. It's pretty much an equal opportunity killer. It kills people of all social classes, but the poor in particular suffer. And this spread rumors. It spread rumors that the wells that the poor got their water from were being poisoned. And what it really amounted to is the poor suffered more from cholera because they lived in denser housing conditions, so it was much easier to communicate the virus, the Vibrio, and to spread cholera. But in any event, though, Hugo does capture what poverty was like, romanticizing it, of course, quite a bit.
Okay, we just have about 30 seconds before we go to the break. Charles Dickens, Tale of Two Cities, the description of the Reign of Terror. Was that accurate or a bit of creative license or both?
Not creative license. What Dickens did was what a recent historian, and by recent I mean over the last 25 years, did, and Simon Schama at Harvard, who's actually a Dutch historian but decided to capitalize on the bicentennial fever of the French Revolution by writing a book called Citizens. And what you do is you exploit the most sanguinary aspects of the French Revolution, and by that I mean heads rolling off of blades and falling into baskets. And this is what Dickens really capitalized on. Now, Dickens had an affinity for the common person, so to speak, but at the same time he was British, and he was prey to this sort of very, very emotional response to the French Revolution that the British had, rather than one that put revolutions in context.
So he captured the visceral sense of the French Revolution in terms of the Reign of Terror at that time.
That would be putting it mildly, but yes.
Okay, we have to take a break now, and when we come back from the break, we'll talk more about the role of the Catholic Church in France during the 19th century, and also what about the split between the rural and the urban population. Stay tuned.
Ever thought about studying the psychological ecology of sharks using robots? Or maybe spending the day not in a classroom, but aboard a large vessel, studying marine life in the ocean, firsthand? The opportunities are endless with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Dr. David Shafer. He's the chair of the history department. And David, before we left, we were talking about the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. We had ended on Charles Dickens and the very visceral presentation of the Reign of Terror. But I also teased before we went to the break that we would talk a little bit more about the role of the Catholic Church, which had been a very dominating role throughout French history up to this point, but did undergo a lot of changes, as you mentioned, because of the Revolution. Napoleon actually did some things that probably helped the Catholic Church, as you mentioned earlier. But overall, what was the role of the Catholic Church in terms of the social and political life of France during the 19th century? I know that was a long stretch of time and it did evolve. But what was that like? And then after that, we'll talk about rural versus urban conflict. Go ahead.
Until the 1850s, the Catholic Church had a monopoly on what existed of public education. This was after Napoleon. We're talking about after the restoration of the Bourbons. They had a monopoly on education. The Catholic Church was, had a much more prominent role to play in rural France than it did in urban France. There was a gender component to that as well. Women tended to be more pious than men. But the Catholic Church was seen as an institution, not individual clerics, not individual parishioners, but as an institution. The Catholic Church was seen as obstructionist of the ideals of the Revolution. It was seen as very tied to traditional France. And by traditional France, I'm talking about an authoritarian France. I'm talking about something that's militaristic, characterized by absolute monarchy, characterized by a socially ossified hierarchical system.
So were they identified with the ultra-royalists?
It was identified. The institution of the church was. Now, having said that, though, a colleague of mine who used to be at UCLA and is now at NYU, Ed Berenson, wrote a book about left-wing politics and populist religion in France, 1830 to 1852, in which he talks about the Catholic Church, about a socialist element in the Catholic Church that talked about the Jesus of the barricades and so on and so forth, and emphasized some of these aspects of it. But on the whole, that was something that was confined to individual priests. It was confined to people who were on the left, who were looking for, perhaps an argument to be made to masses of people that doesn't conflict with their piety.
We think of the church as being historically an institution that is concerned with the needs of the poor. And as we talked about with the French Revolution and some of these other rebellions, it often came down to the poor people or the man on the street being dissatisfied with his circumstances in life because of poverty, because of lack of appropriate necessities and so forth. So you mentioned that the Catholic Church was seen as an institution, so that's one thing, but was the Catholic Church involved, and were there individuals at least within the Catholic Church that were involved in helping the poor and trying to uplift the poor during this time?
There were individuals. As an institution, the Catholic Church has a very spotty record in that regard. Sure, it had, in addition to education, one of the other principal functions that it provided in France was poor relief. But I wouldn't say it did an extraordinarily good job with charity. There have been studies on that, and it did a fair job. But on the other hand, poverty was rife in France in the 19th century. So I wouldn't say that. The other thing is that revolutions in France tended to be more bourgeois, the people involved, until we get to the Paris Commune, which I think we'll probably talk about later. But the Paris Commune is one of the few, and also the sort of revolutionary aftershock in 1848 in June, are two of the few revolutions that really did entail participation by the poor.
And we mentioned the rural versus urban split. Most of us think of France in the 19th century as Paris being the end-all be-all of France, but that's not the case. It's a large rural country. What about that split? Did people in the countryside see politics and social life differently than the folks in Paris?
No, they were gradually being politicized. Now, probably the most famous study on that claims that this politicization, it was a book called Peasants into Frenchmen by Eugene Weber, late Eugene Weber, who used to be a professor of French history at UCLA for years and years and years. Some of your viewers might be aware of him from the Western Civilization series that he did. But in any event, Eugene Weber said that this Peasants into Frenchmen happened in the 1880s, 1890s, towards the end of the 19th century. But on the other hand, there have been studies that have shown that it happened around mid-century, that it was at that time that in rural areas, peasants and also people in just small villages and small towns involved in industrial activity had been really absorbing the message of republicanism in France and the revolution.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move along to the period of the Second Napoleon who takes the throne as an emperor. This is Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. He declares himself emperor in 1852, and that lasted until 1870 when we had the disastrous Franco-Prussian War, and then that was it for him. But during that 18-year period, why did Louis Napoleon see it necessary to declare himself as emperor?
Well, first off, he had been elected president of France in 1848. And he'd been elected president of France in 1848 after there had been these two revolutions, the one in February, which overthrew the last constitutional monarchy in France, and then the one in June, which sought to define that revolution, which saw the revolution betraying the very ideals of the barricades of February. So there's an election for president in December. He's elected president. And it's very difficult to put him in a box. On the one hand, he's seen as representing the last period of glory in French history, that of his uncle. On the other hand, he's also somebody who's seen as a utopian socialist when he was in exile in England. And you have to understand the Bonaparte family after 1815 was persona non grata in France. And he'd just recently been readmitted after the Revolution of 1848. He takes over in 1848 as president, popularly elected by a wide margin, and then he's constrained by term limits, one term. And it was because of that that he decided to launch his coup d'etat and declare himself emperor to suspend the laws. Now, he did so because he felt there was unfinished business. And what he would claim is that he was afraid that France was going to fracture between left and right again, that he represented this kind of hard center. And he had to use repressive means against both the far right royalists and the far left Republicans, to create stability in France. Whether that's true or not is another story. I would say it's probably more self-serving than anything.
And as I mentioned, his reign ended with the Franco-Prussian War, which the French lost badly. And then we had the Paris Commune right at that point of 1871. What was the Paris Commune for our viewers who are not familiar with that period? Because it was a short period, but what was it and why did it stand out?
Short period that's had a lot written on it. It was only lasted 10 weeks from March until third week in May 1871 when it was put down. Now, on one level, I think the interest in the Paris Commune comes down to the fact that during that last week of May, what's called La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, there were probably as many as 30,000 people killed on the streets of Paris in 1 week. So that is a total that far surpasses the entire 9 months of the Reign of Terror and the French Revolution, for sure. What does the Paris Commune mean? Well, coming on the heels of the Franco-Prussian War, it can be seen as a nationalist revolt against a government which is seen as having betrayed the sacrifices Paris endured during the Franco-Prussian War, undergoing a 133-day siege in one of the coldest winters of the 19th century. Most people surviving off of root vegetables and eating rats and mice and cats and dogs, while the wealthy feasted on the animals killed who were at the Jardin des Plantes, elephants and zebras and whatnot. But still a very difficult period. And the government capitulated on the very terms offered before the siege. So there was a sense of betrayal. That could be one motivation. Another motivation could be to decentralize France, to turn it from a very heavily centralized government to one which is based on a federation of communes, of cities that are federated with each other. But the one that I think really epitomizes it, and which brings in the other two elements as well, is that the Paris Commune was a socialist revolution. It was very much in the tradition of the French Revolution. It was an effort to complete the French Revolution, which, in my estimation, in the dissertation I wrote for grad school, my PhD, that all the revolutions of the 19th century were directed at, which was the completion of an unfinished French Revolution, a stolen revolution.
We have to spend just the last couple of minutes we have talking about the Belle Époque. Mm-hmm. The Belle Époque is a period that phrase is translated as the beautiful era, which was around 1780 until just before the First World War. What was the Belle Époque and why was it the beautiful era?
Well, the Belle Époque was a period of stability in France, and it's really seen as the period from about 1880 until a little bit before the start of the First World War. I mean, how can you really define it chronologically with any kind of precision? But still, it was a period of the flourishing of the arts in France in terms of painting, for example. The economy was a bit more robust. France was not fighting revolutions. The Paris Commune had pretty much put the tin hat on that, on the prospect of seizing power from the streets. It wasn't entirely calm, though. in France. There was still an anarchist movement, but the Republic was becoming more stable. The prospects of a return to an authoritarian regime were gradually diminishing. That's not to say it had completely ended. There was, of course, the Dreyfus affair in the 1890s, from 1894 until he was finally exonerated in the beginning of the 20th century. But on the whole, there was this sense of, I don't know, a sense of optimism in France, forward thinking. I guess that's why it's called the Bennet Pope, but it was not quite the beautiful period that we like to think it was entirely.
But there was a flourishing of arts,
flourishing
of science and technology at the time. We remember things like Louis Pasteur, we remember Madame Curie, we remember the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists and that sort of thing. We just have 30 seconds left. I'm going to throw you the ultimate TV question and only give you 30 seconds. If Napoleon were to come back right before 1914, 100 years after he was deposed for the final time, what would have shocked or amazed him about France?
Well, I really hate to engage in counterfactuals, and most historians do, in terms of speculating what a historical character who lived at the beginning of the 19th century would have made of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Obviously, technology, the technological changes. I mean, as we talk about the Belle Epoque, we're talking about a society which has transformed considerably. High-speed trains, the cinema, the telephone, the telegraph. The list goes on and on and on, in terms of medical achievements as well. So this, I think, would have surprised him. I think what would have surprised him is the way warfare is fought. And there were quite a few changes in that were occurring just on the eve of the First World War that would manifest themselves more so in the First World War. I think he would have been perhaps surprised by the extent to which the principles of the French Revolution had been absorbed by the population.
And we have to end on that note, but thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.